Okay, so we're going to talk about the Battle of Midway today. Last time we were talking about Pearl Harbor, and we talked about how the United States started producing more ships and such, and we're talking about how the Japanese wanted to attack us at Midway. So the Japanese had made kind of a fake attack up here to the Aleutian Islands. Now they had brought some troops up there, but the Japanese had brought a fake attack up here to the north of the Aleutian Islands that we owned, and they had made, but their main force was moving towards Midway. And for the United States, we had already broken the Japanese codes. We already knew what the Japanese were doing. So we went to Midway as well to stop the Japanese from taking over the island. In the Battle of Midway, let me explain kind of what happened here. So in the Battle of Midway, you have the Japanese show up. They're in blue. So the Japanese show up. They start launching some planes from their aircraft carriers to attack Midway. So they launch some planes to go attack Midway. And after those planes attacked Midway and such, the Japanese were also sending out scouting planes to kind of find, where, or not really find, but to kind of just search out and make sure there weren't any ships in the area, because they didn't know the United States was in the area or not, but they were sending out scout planes just in case there were. Eventually, the Japanese do spot one of our carriers, the Yorktown, which is here in gray. So they do end up eventually spotting the Yorktown when it kind of enters into the area. And we had two other aircraft carriers besides the Yorktown. So we had the Yorktown, and we also had the Enterprise and the Hornet. So we had three aircraft carriers there, and the Japanese had four: the Akage, Kage, Haru, and Soru. So the Japanese, as they launched some attacks on Midway. They were weakening up the island of Midway in preparation for landing troops on the island of Midway and taking it over. Eventually, once they spot the American carriers that were coming on to the area, they went to this figure eight pattern, and that was to switch up their bombs on their planes from what you would use for bombing a defensive position on an island to bombs that could rip through the side of a ship, so like torpedoes and so forth. So the Japanese kind of go for this pattern. They're switching over to bombs and such. They eventually kind of go through this big old pattern here, kind of switching up stuff and such. Eventually, what happens to the United States, we figure out where they're at kind of first. So we kind of figure out where they're at first. You can kind of see right here, like you see this little kind of gold green guys right there. Those are guys from Midway. So the planes from Midway knew where the Japanese were. They told our aircraft carriers about that. Our aircraft carriers engaged them once over here. So we engaged them once over here. Weren't able really to do anything. But later on in the day, we were able to engage them again over here. And when we engaged them again over here, we were able to destroy three of their aircraft carriers. So you kind of see with a little like fire symbol. And then 1, 2, 3 aircraft carriers were destroyed over here. So we kind of found where they were. We were able to kind of destroy three of their aircraft carriers. Eventually, the Japanese were able to find a Yorktown, and they did a significant amount of damage to it right here at this position. We're able to get the Yorktown moving again, but they found it later on in the day and then completely destroyed the Yorktown later on in the day. So it was 2 U.S. aircraft carriers versus one one Japanese carrier. So we had 2 U.S. carriers versus 1 Japanese carrier. And you can see how the Japanese started kind of moving towards this way, kind of moving like towards us. So you kind of see where we're at and how we started kind of moving away, and they were kind of moving towards where we were, kind of slightly moving towards where we were. The reason for that was that since the Japanese had lost 3 aircraft carriers, they were hoping to pull our entire Navy, our aircraft carrier plus battleships and other things, into an open sea battle. And they were hoping that in a one-on-one sea battle, they could do a significant amount of damage to us. However, instead of us kind of, engaging them and then getting pulled into a big open sea battle of battleships versus battleships and so forth, instead we were kind of just pulling out of the area. So you kind of see we're kind of moving out of the area. Eventually, though, even though we're moving out of the area, we did find their last aircraft carrier later in the day. We were able to hit it, and eventually their last aircraft carrier sank. So of the 4 aircraft carriers that the Japanese brought to Midway, all 4 were destroyed. Of the U.S. aircraft carriers that were brought to Midway, we only lost 1, which was the Yorktown. And pretty much after this point, with those 4 aircraft carriers destroyed of the Japanese, they really were never able to get into a good position Navy-wise again for the rest of the war. So this loss of 4 of their aircraft carriers was significant enough for them that the momentum of the war from this point onward will be in the favor of the United States, and would just be the United States on the offensive for the rest of the war. Go ahead and make a 1. And we're write down, Japanese lose 4 of its precious aircraft carriers. So 1, Japanese Navy loses 4 of its precious aircraft carriers. Okay. And even though Japan lost a lot of its aircraft carriers, as I said, this was going to be a big turning point. And for the rest of the war, the United States will be on the offense. So we'll be on the offense for the rest of the war. There was a couple other things that were also kind of damaged or destroyed at Midway. So you can see this is a Japanese battleship, and you can see how much damage it had kind of taken. Eventually, it will sink. So we kind of figured out that, battleships really weren't all that useful. I mean, if you can pull into a giant open sea battle, then they're pretty useful. But since aircraft carriers, you can have a plane launch from a long distance away, they're a lot cheaper, or the planes, anyways, are a lot cheaper than the aircraft carrier. The aircraft carriers just became a lot more useful. But we did find a new thing for battleships to do, and that was to have a role in bombarding. Go ahead and make it 2. And write down, battleships found a new role in bombarding. So battleships found a new role in bombarding. And bombarding is simply when you have your cannons of your ship fire at a defensive position, like at an island, at a whole bunch of defensive positions, like a bunker, for example. And your cannons on your battleship just fire at those emplacements and try to destroy them. So bombarding is just when you have ships at sea firing on something on land and trying to destroy it. That's basically what bombarding is. So I guess 2 is battleships found a new role in bombarding. Okay, so as I was talking about before, we also engaged in the operation of island hopping when we went from one island to the next island and so forth. And these are some of the islands that we took over from the Japanese. This is Terra Atoll. So even though we had the battleships to kind of do a lot of damage, as you can see, this island's pretty ripped up. Even though we could do a ton of damage to the island, once we landed on those islands and tried to take them over from the Japanese, it was pretty difficult. It was not an easy thing to take over every single island from the Japanese. This is a picture of Iwo Jima. This is where the movie Flags Are Our Fathers was set at. Go ahead, make a bullet, and write down island hopping. So bullet, island hopping. I kind of talked about island hopping before and how you take over an island, and after you take over an island, you then move on to a new island, take over that island, move all your stuff then to a new island, so forth and so on. So you take over island, you move everything in to that new island, then use that island to attack another island and move everything over. So that's kind of island hopping. You don't leave like anything behind when you do island hopping. You just take over the island, and then once you take it over, move everything to the next place. And as I talked about before, there was 3 operations that we had against the Japanese. So the first one was moving west here. So this was the first one, moving west here, doing island hopping. The second one was north from Australia. And then the third one was bringing troops over here to kind of push against the Japanese in Burma because they were trying to take over this area. So the Japanese were kind of coming in through here and trying to push in towards India. And so we sent troops over there to kind of stop them. So we're going to make a bullet and we're going to write island hopping. So bullet, island hopping, if you haven't done so yet. As the war was going on, the Japanese started to become pretty desperate, especially when we get into kind of until later on in the war, 1944, 1945. And when we got to that point in time in the war, the Japanese started getting pretty desperate, and they started using kamikaze pilots. A kamikaze pilot is basically just someone who flies a plane into one of our ships to try and do damage or destroy the ship. And so that's kind of what kamikaze is. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures here. So over the course of May of 1942 until May of 1945, we were able to push all the way over to right here, which is Okinawa, which is within bomber range of Japan. So we could actually start using our big bombers against Japan. So it took us 3 years to get from here to here. So it's a very long time of just kind of moving across to get to a point where we could start attacking the Japanese and start doing damage to them. Going to make a 1. It became obvious the U.S. possessed more and better war technology. So by the time we get to 1943 and we start producing planes that are better than what the Japanese had, it became pretty obvious that our war technology was just at a way higher level than what the Japanese was. And we could kind of just control everything. Okay. And then I had kind of gone ahead and talked about how we took over Okinawa. Okinawa Island, it says, within bomber range of Japan, and we can start using kind of more bigger and heavier bombers against them. Go ahead and make a number 2, if you would. And we're write down Okinawa Island, May of 1945. So 2, Okinawa Island, May 1945. And once you got that down, that's all we're doing for today.